Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 6 of the Sharks-Avalanche series, in which the Avalanche won and staved off elimination 4-3 in overtime. Both these teams put their perfect overtime records to the test with this game. Both of them had been 2-0 in the first round, and it was the Avalanche who emerged with the 3-0 perfect record, while the Sharks get a blemish on theirs to make it 2-1. And now we will head back for Game 7 to San Jose. That one will, of course, be on Wednesday. But this first period started off as you'd expect for the Avalanche, as they were obviously the more desperate team with their backs against the wall facing elimination tonight, while the Sharks obviously had the cushion of the potential Game 7. And the Avalanche are playing a very strong first period. In the first few minutes, they're dominating most of the play. Jones is keeping them off the board. And eventually the Sharks sort of even it out a bit, but the Avalanche bring it back again near the end of that first period. And by the end of it, the Avalanche were clearly the better team, and it's looking a lot like a copy of what happened in Game 4 of this series, in which the Sharks had great goaltending from Jones, pretty solid defense, but the offense sort of just fell through for them. And that didn't change early in the second period. About 10 minutes into it, I believe the Avalanche get the goal from Tyson Jost to take a 1-0 lead. The Sharks still getting nothing done offensively. At a point, they had, I think, 7 shots with about 7 or 6 minutes left in the second period, which was just downright embarrassing. It was really looking like Game 4, except without the inflated shot totals that made it look a lot better than it actually was. However, it only took a slight spark for the Sharks to find their game in that second period. Timo Meier, on what I think was either the 8th or 9th shot for the Sharks in this game, drives the net, gets this puck available. Marc-Edouard Vlasic gets the goal, and the Sharks are in a tie game, in a game they probably didn't deserve to be 1-1 at that point. Eventually, JT Compher for the Avalanche, with just a couple minutes left, makes it 2-1, but it's Brent Burns with just a couple seconds left who makes it 2-2, and we head into the third period. Now, it was not that much of a surprise that the Avalanche came out at the start of the third period the better team. This is a team who is potentially playing their final 20 minutes of their year, while the Sharks, of course, you'd like to see them come out better, but it's hard to match that intensity that the Avalanche bring when the Sharks don't have their backs against the wall, especially all that emotion that came in that first round. It's difficult to match that in this game when you're not against elimination like the Avalanche are. And so the Avalanche get that early goal from Compher to make it 3-2. The Sharks had not yet led in this game, as it was each time the Avalanche who took the 1-goal lead. And similar to the first 2 times, the Sharks eventually, with about 2.5 or so minutes left, get the game-tying goal for the third time. It's Marc-Edouard Vlasic once more, a pretty lucky one that goes off the skate of Nikita Zadorov, and we head to the overtime. And we only had 3 penalties called in the first period. Then there was one on Michael Haley about halfway through the second period, at which point the penalties disappeared. The refs put away their whistle, which I don't have a huge problem with in the playoffs, of course. And I said back in Game 6 against the Golden Knights that if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you're only calling a penalty if it's something like a delay of game and you have to call it, or if it is against a prime scoring chance. And that's why I was so upset when they called the penalty on Barclay Goodrow with the slash on Braden McNabb, because it wasn't a prime scoring chance. But we saw at the start of this overtime, Marcus Sorensen, he's got what is basically an open net. There's a high chance he can put this puck in if he can get the shot away, and he's got Nikita Zadorov's stick completely parallel in the hands, blatant hooking on a prime scoring chance, and the refs don't call it. This isn't an arbitrary line in the sand. This isn't some sort of call out of the blue. This is a perfect chance for Marcus Sorensen to end the game, to end the series, and that's probably the reason why the refs don't call it. But Nikita Zadorov commits a stick infraction here, and it goes uncalled. Then to make matters worse, the Avalanche basically go the other way within the next few seconds and get the game-winning goal. Now, of course, I'm not blaming the refs here for this victory. The Sharks, if they actually wanted to win this one, they probably should have showed up before the 35 minutes into this game. But it is still unfortunate, and it's, again, to use that usual cliche, it seemed as though you could have murdered a person on the ice and you still wouldn't get it called 2 minutes, especially if it was on the Avs, who were, of course, on the brink of elimination. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who ended up being okay in this game. I guess maybe you could upgrade that to pretty good. He obviously wasn't as good as he was in, let's say, Game 5, but he was still quite solid. Didn't have much of a chance on the Jost, the second Compher goal. The Landeskog one was weird. It bounced like 3 times on the ice in front, so it was certainly a tough one for Jones to track. And then the first Compher one was you know how sometimes I mentioned when it's like a seeing eye puck that's basically a 1 in 100? Well, the Avalanche have tried this exact play with the player taking that shot from basically the blue line in the middle of it, and most of the time it's blocked, most of the time it's saved, but eventually you try it enough, trial and error, and it will eventually go in, and that was basically in this game. So it's not a terrible game for Martin Jones. I still thought he was pretty good. He made a couple of spectacular saves. He was huge in keeping the Sharks within one goal for the majority of this game, but it also wasn't his best game of the series like it was in Game 5. Next would be the first line, probably the only good line for the Sharks here tonight. Even though they weren't super apparent in the first half of this game, Meier obviously had a strong second period. He set up both of the goals in the second period, Vlasic and Burns, with spectacular solo efforts. Logan Couture, while he wasn't super apparent, he did get a couple of fantastic chances that he somehow failed to bury. And then Gustav Nyquist, also pretty decent. Not much to say about him there. I would have just written Meier and Couture, but I decided to just cover the first line in general because they have been quite solid for the Sharks throughout this entire series. But the main problem, again, from this game, from this loss, is that it's been the second and third lines who have been slacking, and I've mentioned that time and time again, but I will focus in particular on Evander Kane, because at the very least, the third line for the Sharks came up big in Game 1. At the very least, Tomas Hertl came up big last game in Game 5, but besides Evander Kane's nice goal in the first period of the second game, he really hasn't done much of anything, and I will disagree with the fact that people are saying that Evander Kane has been awful in this series. I don't think I would go that far. I think Kane has been half decent. I think he's been okay, but in the regular season, you can get away with being okay for a few games in a row because eventually you'll probably break through. But in the playoffs, you need a lot more desperation than that. So while he hasn't been awful, and I won't say he's been awful, he's only been okay, and that is not good enough for a player of Kane's caliber. Again, we've seen so many players here, forwards and even on defense. Brent Burns, Marc-Edouard Vlasic had 2 goals in this game, Erik Karlsson, all step up for the Sharks at different times during this series, and Evander Kane is basically the only big Sharks player at this point. Even Jones has stepped up. He's the only big Sharks player at this point who hasn't really shown up in a game, and not necessarily just carried it completely like Logan Couture did in Game 3 with his hat trick, but been an offensive force. He hasn't shown up like that, which has been extremely disappointing. You wonder if he's been playing through an injury or anything like that. It doesn't seem to be the case, and the only thing he's really provided in this series at this point, besides decent play, has been undisciplined penalties. Finally, I will talk about a few words here as the Sharks head to their second Game 7 in these playoffs, a back-to-back Game 7 after they win off against the Golden Knights. Hopefully they'll have a better performance in this Game 7 than they did against the Golden Knights. Of course, they ended up winning that one, obviously, but starting off down 3-0 at home, 45 minutes into this game probably isn't the best look, and they don't want to try and put themselves in a position like that against the Avalanche. A few things here. Will Joe Pavelski play in Game 7 is obviously a huge question. He was here in Denver, but he didn't dress in Game 6. Obviously, this wasn't a do-or-die game, but now it is. So you wonder if Joe Pavelski draws in the lineup. That would probably move Nyquist down to the second line and then Donskoy to the fourth. I wonder if they'll do that. Nyquist wasn't, again, that great on this line, but this game, but he has been quite solid with them for this series. So I wonder if DeBoer decides to mess with that chemistry, or if maybe he just tries to put Pavelski with Kane and Hertl. That could be something that they could try if, of course, Pavelski does return from injury in that game. And I also want to say, while coming in against the Golden Knights, I was much more nervous than I was here tonight. The Avalanche are a strong team, and I do commend them, and I think they have played a solid series. But I do think the Sharks should be able to get that Game 7 win. They are the home team. They have looked, I feel like, the better team for the majority of this series, besides Game 4, which just looked completely off for the Sharks offensively. And I guess some here of Game 6, but even with a pretty off game for the majority of that game, they still managed to force overtime. I feel as though the Sharks have been at the very least the slightly better team for the majority of these games. I feel like they are the better team than the Avalanche. And so while I was very worried about the Golden Knights in Games 5, 6, and especially 7, and they proved why they should have been a worrying team with how Game 6 and Game 7 especially started out. I do think the Sharks should be able to take this. They're going to have that desperation. They'll be able to match it against the Avalanche. They'll have the last change. They did a good job at shutting down the McKinnon line in this game. They just didn't shut down the Comfer line, if that's even a term that you can use. There were some individual mistakes from players like Erik Karlsson and Brendan Dillon on that Comfort goal. There was, again, a 1 in 100 chance on the first Comfort goal, a couple bad bounces on the Landeskog one. And so in general, the Sharks didn't play very well. Commend the Avalanche for playing a solid game here, but it still ended up being quite close. And I think once the Sharks get it together, they realize that this is a do-or-die game here in Game 7. They'll be able to take the win. But that will do it for this review. As I said, the Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. They will be the final game of these playoffs. Of course, the Boston Bruins ended out their series in 6 games on the road here tonight against the Columbus Blue Jackets. Tomorrow, we'll see who the Sharks could potentially face off against when the Stars and the Blues play their Game 7. So once more, the Sharks head to a Game 7. They will have 0 rest going into the 3rd round if they manage to win, as I believe they'll probably get the Thursday off, but then Friday will be the start of their series, because I know the NHL do not like to waste time, because they do not like to play hockey into June. So it's going to be tough if the Sharks do it, but we've seen it before, quite recently actually, 2014, the Los Angeles Kings, 3 Game 7s through their first 3 rounds, and they won the Stanley Cup that year. So there's no giving up hope here for the Sharks. They can come up clutch, as they have done already in these playoffs. Class dismissed.